And hello, first thing I'd like you to do today in this module is, well, I would like to do with you is go over your cell transport worksheet, just like we would do on a normal day, both passive and active transport. The first over here is on the passive, then we'll get into the active in the second half. This first part here starts with 4 multiple choice, making sure that you understand some of the terminology and what is happening. So let's get at it here. Your first question was, which of the following must be true for diffusion? We talked about diffusion as one of the 3 different types: passive transport along with osmosis and facilitated diffusion. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about diffusion or osmosis or facilitated diffusion. With passive transport, there's one thing that is always true, and that is that the particles always move from where there are more of them to where there are less of them. And when we talk about more or less, we're talking about the concentration. So the correct answer, and I'm just going to highlight this, is C. There must be areas of different concentrations. And as I said, in diffusion and passive transport, it always is going to move from where there's more of it, higher concentration, to where there's less of it, lower concentration. Now, if there is a condition in which no net change in concentration results from diffusion, and that's actually what passive transport is trying to accomplish, that doesn't mean there isn't any movement of particles. It's just that the overall net difference stays the same, and that is what we call equilibrium. This is what the cell is trying to accomplish through passive transport. Now, one of the things, or one of the ways this works in our body, is how we get oxygen into our bloodstream. And the air that we breathe in, or the air in the room, so to speak, has a higher concentration of oxygen than what we have in our lung cells. Now, since the air that we breathe in is higher than what is actually inside the cells because of what we just went over about diffusion, the oxygen is going to diffuse into the cells. So there'll be a net increase inside the lung cells, and that is because the higher concentration of oxygen outside is going to move into the lung cells to try to reach equilibrium. Once that oxygen gets in these lung cells, it passes into some capillaries and gets to our bloodstream, where it can be carried off and put into, or actually not in the bloodstream, it gets carried off and taken towards the heart, where it can be put into the blood. Okay, that leads us to number 4. Which of the following statements tells how facilitated diffusion differs from simple diffusion? Facilitated means that it needs help. And as I went over this in class, I told you that sometimes particles are so big they can't get through. Okay, so they need some help getting across the membrane. We're still moving stuff from high concentration to low concentration. So in order to do that, we have to use what are called channel proteins that allow these larger particles to pass through. So again, for questions 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have letter C, letter B, letter D, and letter C. Okay, again, I'll double check, make sure you have the right answers. If you did miss one, just correct your answer before resubmitting your assignment. So let's move on down here. And this time we're going to look at the 3 different types of solutions. We have an isotonic solution, meaning there is equal amount of solute and solution inside the cell and outside the cell. We have a hypertonic solution. Hyper means more solute, less water. Okay, so there's going to be more water and less solute inside the cell. And then in a hypotonic solution, we're going to have the solution is going to have a low amount of solute and a high amount of water compared to the cell. So the cell is going to have a lower amount of water and a higher amount of solute. So what's going to be the resulting thought here? Well, in isotonic, iso meaning equal, that means that the particles and the water, the solute and the solvent, are equal both inside and outside the cell. Yes, there is going to still be movement, as we mentioned earlier, but the cells will stay the same. Okay, the cells will stay the same. So our answer right here for this one should be letter C. Okay, again, this should be letter C. So I'll just put a couple lines here, a couple lines there, and we will be good to go. Sorry about that. Now, as we move down here, just go here in the middle. And we have cells in a hypertonic solution. Now again, I just went over hypertonic. That means that the surrounding solution has more solute and less water. So that means you're going to have more water inside the cells than out. So the result here is that the cells start pumping their water out. So the cell is going to lose water. Okay. And then finally, that must mean then in this case, obviously that leaves us with B, that the cell is going to gain water here. Okay, and again, why does it lose water? Because in a hypotonic solution, that means that the cell is hypertonic, so that means the cell has more solute, less water, and water is going to move in, and the cell will begin to swell. Okay, so based on what we just learned, we should be able to do number 8. Now, I told you guys that you could just find pictures, and in this case, we're doing the hypertonic solution. Again, in a hypertonic solution, cells are going to lose water, so you can see that water is moving out in both cases. The cells begin to shrivel up. Now, in the case of the plant cell, it's the membrane that begins to shrivel up. The cell wall does maintain its shape, but in each case, you are dehydrating the cell. Okay, so now let's move on to active transport. What is the function of active transport in moving small molecules and ions across the cell membrane? Why is this so important to do? This allows movement of materials against the gradient, which is what we talked about in class. And examples of this, an example of this is the movement of potassium and sodium in your muscles, and nerves. Okay, again, in order for our muscles and nerves to be able to function properly, we have to go against the gradient with these ions, and that is when we're contracting our muscles or we're sending nerve signals across there. Okay, so very important that in order for our muscle cells to be able to work, that they can move things against the gradient. This, again, being active transport, requires the cell to use some energy. So how does that cell use energy, or where does it get that energy from? That's all that question 10 here is about. So let's hop down here. How does ATP enable transport chains to move ions across the cell membrane? Okay, the energy from the ATP is used to change the shape of the proteins. Okay, it changes the shape of the proteins, and changing the shape of the proteins requires energy. And what do we call these types of proteins that are used in active transport? You should have read about this while you were reading through your book. That's why I wanted you to have your book. These are called protein pumps. And they're exactly what they are, because they pump the materials, in this case the ions, as we see in number 9, across the membrane. They push them across. It's just like a sup pump that you would have in your house to pump out water. That has to be plugged in and requires electricity. These protein pumps get their energy from the ATP. Now, as we continue, okay, we got to this, and there is times that we have to use bulk transport. That means we're moving large materials, or large amount of materials at a time. If we look at endocytosis and exocytosis, literally into the cytoplasm, out of the cytoplasm. Now, why is this a form of active transport? Because the membrane has to be able to change its shape. So endocytosis is the movement, sorry, I wanted this to be red, the movement of materials into the cell by changing, or by folding the membrane, I should say. And this is the movement, sorry, let me fix this again. Movement of materials out of the cell by folding the membrane. We kind of somewhat mentioned this early on when we talked about how vesicles can be used to move things from the Golgi apparatus to the cell membrane, and then those proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates can be released, and this is the way it does this. Now, we have a special type of endocytosis, okay, called phagocytosis, and in phagocytosis, this is a type, excuse me, let me fix this. This again is a type of endocytosis that creates a food vacuole. We talked about vacuoles as storage. This is one way that organisms can create food vacuoles inside the cell. Okay, there is another type of endocytosis called pinocytosis, and pinocytosis is a way of, instead of making a food vacuole, what it does is it collects or allows liquids to pass through. Okay. And finally, the last thing is just checking your understanding of the 3 different types of things. Most sports drinks are isotonic in relation to explain why athletes should drink these types of solutions rather than ones that are hypotonic. And again, if you remember what hypotonic does, we'll go back here, but hypotonic solutions right here cause cells to gain water. Okay, so why do we prefer isotonic solutions over hypotonic solutions and even hypertonic? But we'll focus on the hypotonic well. The isotonic solution allows, both water and nutrients to be replenished. Sorry, I don't know why that went up there, but it did. while hypotonic solution